So in my other video, I talked about kind of one of the things that I do, and it's really just understanding how wood moves and milling and resting it properly and managing the biology and the physics of water movement through the grain and how you construct to kind of take care of that. But yeah, in this video, which I'm sure both of you who commented on this know this in more detail, it's more kind of for general folks who need to better understand wood movement. Let's talk a little bit about how wood moves and why it moves and in what direction it might move. So here is a tree trunk looking down that, from the ground up or vice versa, and growth rings. So obviously, as the tree goes under what's called secondary growth, starts to lay down more and more growth rings as it gets thicker through the seasons. That's kind of what you get when you look at it. You can see each growth ring, and those growth rings are comprised of basically there's a bunch of different types of cells, but two major ones, xylem and phloem. Xylem is the vertical, continuous, hollow, quote unquote, dead cells. They're just a cell wall for the most part, without going into too much detail, that conduct water vertically through the tree. Phloem is what conducts what they call secondary metabolites and sugars and that kind of stuff. Xylem is much more prevalent than phloem when you're looking especially a secondary growth tree, like a large tree trunk, where we get our lumber. And all of these things are like a bundle of straws, and they run lengthwise down a board or lengthwise down the tree. And because each of these cells is open to the atmosphere, water through what's called osmotic potential or water potential is to be able to move in and out of that to kind of make its way towards an equilibration with the relative humidity in the atmosphere. So having properly dried lumber, trying to remove as much water from the cells themselves, and then the relative humidity. If it's higher in the air, it's going to lose water. The opposite. If it's higher in the air, it's going to absorb water and swell. And if it's lower in the air, it's going to lose water and shrink. Now, when we cut lumber, this would be a very crude diagram. This would be a quarter sawn, or maybe a rift sawn, depending on what part of the tree you're cutting. And then a flat or plain sawn might be something like this, where the growth rings run in an arc. And in quarter sawn, the growth rings, because of how it's cut from the round trunk, tend to run vertically. And you can see that here. There's a nice piece of 8-quarter cherry and a piece of quarter sawned walnut, at least at my suppliers. And because generally the yield of what you get from a tree, it's pretty rare to get quartered unless you're milling yourself. That's thicker than 4-quarter or 5-quarter. But that's neither here nor there. So we'll look at it as the grain. So you can see here, this grain is arched because this came from a tree that goes around in this circle. And then this is quartered. So more of these growth rings, these lines of grain, run vertically because the tree's passing like this, and they're cut at a thickness that helps align that grain vertically, and you get this really nice quartered look. Now, wood moves in basically 3 directions, radially, tangentially, and longitudinally. Longitudinal will be along the length of the board. And if you can think, because these are basically hollow straws along the long length of the board, there's no the pressure of the water is what creates the wood movement. So the cells swell. There's no walls at the ends of these. So the pressure of the water flowing into them or leaving them doesn't push on anything or swell the wood out very much. There are little gap junctions and stuff between many xylem, but for the most part, water can move freely as it does in the living tree. And so you don't get much wood movement longitudinally. The secondary wood movement, where you get a little bit more wood movement, is what we call radially. So in this one, the radial grain movement would be along this line. So in a flat sawn board, radially is going to be like your thickness. So these radii are going to swell like this. And that's why you might get radial wood movement that causes cupping. You'll also get, in combination, radial wood movement across this, which is not going to lead to as much cupping because of how the grain is oriented. And because the grain is more or less aligned, the radial movement is not nearly as much. It's a little bit in this direction, but since all the lines are stacked up, you get some of the movement in this direction, which would be along the radius of curved grain that goes like this, same as in your flat sawn. Now, the type of wood movement that you get the most wood movement is what's called tangential, or tangential to the grain. So if we all remember our geometry, the tangent is the line that just barely touches a radius. And so tangential wood movement, width-wise, in flat sawn boards, is where you get the most wood movement. And it depends on the species and what the difference in relative humidity is throughout the year, in terms of winter and summer, if there are wet and dry seasons. But tangential wood movement, the most wood movement you're going to get in quarter sawn is going to be right along this grain. And the reason you get cupping here is because these radii don't expand the same amount across the radius. And so you can get a bending of the wood along that radius, but because this grain is ideally, hopefully, as vertically oriented as possible in your quarter sawn, your movement, the most movement you get usually in quarter sawn is vertically. Could be, for a small board, less than a 1/16 of an inch or so. And really, because the grain's wide, you don't get much radial movement at all, although wood still does move. And so you can see that here in a flat sawn board. Here's our grain. Longitudinally would be vertically here. Radially would be up and down this way as that swells and might potentially lead to some cupping. And then tangential wood movement would be tangent to that grain right across the front. And because in quarter sawn, here are our grain lines, not perfectly straight, but more vertical, minimizes that tangential movement. And the most movement you get is really in this direction across the front of the face. So with the kind of reveals that we do on those doors, tends to not be very much that we would worry about the reveal closing up and the door sticking. But again, properly dried lumber and being mindful of how the biology works. So anyways, hope that helps for those of you who are looking to better understand wood movement and why one might want to choose, for instance, a quarter sawn piece of wood if you're wanting to keep a panel particularly flat, if it's not supported. This can give you, wood's gonna move, something could happen, things can go differently. There are ways to combat wood movement in terms of the joinery you use and stabilization, and obviously making sure your wood can dry and acclimate properly. You can check out the other video on that a little bit, but hope that helps for those of you who are interested in this.